Morning, everyone.
Morning.
So we're in week 2 of a series that we're calling Broken, and I just feel like giving a heads up on the series we're doing next. The Walking Dead starts on October the 12th, so I've got a great series planned called Church versus Zombies. It's going to be the best ever. There you go. Yeah, you'll love it. Anyway, so at the moment we're doing a serious series called Broken. And in this series, we're really just stating the obvious. Life is sometimes difficult. And this morning we're going to talk a little bit about the difficulties that are experienced within and are caused by our social interactions with our fellow human beings. Let's just say it. People are great. People cause problems. People are fun to be around. People sometimes do your head in. Our context for this discussion will be a part of the New Testament called the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians, and will be in chapter 3 and verse 12, which says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved." So in this sentence, he's talking to the church. People in the church, people who, just like you, don't live perfect lives. People who, just like you, had issues that they struggled with, temptations that they succumbed to, insecurities and hang-ups that made them limp through life. Normal people. And he wants those normal people with those normal issues and normal struggles to know exactly where they stand with their God. And so he says, I want you to know at the outset of our conversation that as far as God is concerned, you're holy, you're chosen, and you're really quite dearly loved. So this is a simple reiteration of the biblical view that you didn't choose to get involved with God. It was God who chose to get involved with you. And I know that's not what you think. You think that the circumstances of your life conspired in a certain way to bring you to a point where you thought, well, maybe I better explore this whole God thing and maybe get into the Jesus thing and give the Christian thing a little bit of a try, and that all that was somehow your choice. That is not the complete perspective of the Bible. The perspective of the Bible is that God himself, with abandoned pleasure, says the choice wasn't yours to make, it was mine. Hence we hear him say from the pages of his word, you didn't choose me. I know you think that's how it was, but it wasn't. It was me who chose you. And I think that's quite a nice thing to hear, particularly in the mix of all the stuff that you struggle with. The temptations, the brokennesses, the loneliness, the dark desires, the depression, the disappointment. It's helpful to know that you are God's loved one, that he views you with a certain treasure, that if his house was on fire and he had to run back in for just one thing, it would be you. And so we approach this part of the Bible hearing that your life may well be imperfect, even by your own low standards. But your life isn't the reason you stand where you stand with the God who made you. You are chosen. You are loved. Now, a person familiar with the literature of the Bible will recognize this as being the sort of language that the Bible uses to describe the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. For example, have a look at this. So speaking of Israel, the writer says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God." Well, why would that be so? Why would God use that language of us? "The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of this earth to be his people, his treasured possession." Well, why would he do a thing like that? The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for indeed you were the fewest of all peoples. It was simply because he loved you. Get it? You're loved. And that you're loved, you're special, you're treasured language is also the language that the New Testament uses to describe Jesus. So you'll remember perhaps that when Jesus gets baptized, there's this line in the Gospels where a voice is heard from heaven saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. I am pleased with him." So in this sentence, talking to a group of people in the church, people just like you, just like me, dealing with the same issues, the same darknesses, the same disappointments, the same brokenness, the Apostle Paul chooses to use very elevated vocabulary. Vocabulary used in the Bible both of Israel and of Jesus himself. You, regardless of what you're facing right now, regardless of what you're going through, regardless of whose fault it is, are loved by the God with whom you deal. So whatever else may be said of you, whatever else may be true of you, from the perspective of the Bible, you're special to the God who chose you. And I like this, because when we experience brokenness, we easily assume that our brokenness defines us. And I get that. However, I find it helpful to hear the Bible say, okay, so you're broken. Okay, so you're going through issues and there's some things that we need to talk about. But before we talk about those things, we need to clarify the framework of the conversation. And that framework is, you're okay. You're okay. God knows you. He loves you. He forgives you. He's for you. He likes you. And so whatever else we go on to talk about, none of that changes. None of that is up for discussion. You're fine. Because that's the case, he then goes on to say that you should clothe yourselves. So notice the logic. I'm now going to go on and talk about the sorts of virtues that you should be adopting in your lifestyle, particularly your social interactions with other people. And that's a conversation we need to have. It's a conversation that's very important. But it's not a conversation about where you stand with God. That's already been made clear in the opening salvo. You're chosen, you're loved, you're special. That's not up for discussion. Only once that's understood can we go on and have this conversation about the kind of things that should be happening in your interactions with others. Okay, so as a person whom God loves, he says, you should clothe yourself, and then he lists a whole bunch of virtues, beginning with compassion. The word compassion there means in Greek it means the emotions that you have in your bowels. Strange thing to say, I suppose. In the ancient world, people believed that a person's physiology was linked to a person's psychology, and they believed that the bowels was where the emotions came from. So what Paul is, and we still talk that way today. Do you ever use the phrase, I got a bad gut feeling about this? Or, I suppose related to the bowels, that person smells funny to me. Fair enough. So what Paul is saying here is that because you are where you are with God, because you have this unassailable status and relationship with him, you should be the kind of person who deeply feels somewhere in your gut what other people are going through. And of course, who in the Bible is like this? Who feels deeply the things that others go through? God himself. Right throughout the Bible, you get the impression that God feels and feels strongly what other people go through. And so because that's what God is like, and because you and God are okay, you really are, you should be a bit like that in your interactions with others. It shouldn't all be about you. The conversations, the activities, the wants and the needs and the desires, it shouldn't all be about you. You as a Christian should be about others. Then he says you should clothe yourself with kindness. It's a very loaded word in the Bible. It's a word that the Bible uses to describe an extraordinary, in fact, irresponsible loyalty that is shown to a person who just doesn't deserve it. So, this is a word that would be used to describe what happens when the owner of a business gives a renewed contract to an employee who has hitherto been nothing but useless. And then at night the employer goes home, sits down with his wife and has dinner and says, "Hey, I gave Johnson a new contract." And the wife is just, "What? Don't you know how much of an idiot Johnson is? Don't you remember how many sleepless nights you've had because of Johnson's idiocy? Don't you remember how often you had to have a glass of scotch just to cope with his inefficiency? Don't you remember how many sales he lost you? Don't you remember all the things he's put you through? Why on earth would you give him a new contract?" And then the employer would say, "Well, yeah, you're right, I know. But you see, last week I just found out that Johnson's wife has got cancer, and they're going to need the benefits, and the kids are having a difficult time at school. So I kind of figured being nice to him was the nice thing to do. I mean, it's nice to be important, and it's nice to be right, and it's nice to be efficient, but I think it's more important to be nice." And that's just kind of where it was coming from. Sorry. This, the Bible says, is kind of what we are to be like. God himself has shown us a loyalty and a kindness that would be bordering on irresponsible of him. We too are to be a little bit like this in our dealings with others. So quiet. Then he says you should clothe yourself with humility. The word humility that he uses here is, again in Greek, is a compound word made up of two separate words. The first being the word tapaino, which is a word that was used in the New Testament to describe someone who was pretty much at the bottom. So the New Testament would say that a person who works in McDonald's for a living and who lives in government housing and who really can't get by in life is a person who is tapaino. They're pretty much at the bottom of the social scale. And then the second word is the word phroneo, which means to think. So the word tapaino, meaning flipping burgers in McDonald's, barely getting by, and the word phroneo, meaning to think, are brought together in the New Testament to form really a brand new word, tapaino phrosuno, meaning to think of yourself as though you were at the bottom. To look in the mirror and see yourself as a person who struggles, a person who doesn't get by and isn't worth all that much. This is the meaning of the New Testament word humility. Now perhaps it's an obvious point to make, but not everyone who read these words, and certainly not everyone who reads them, is at the bottom of the social scale. That's certainly true for us. None of us are languishing there, I don't think. In fact, if we take the entire population of the world into account, we're all pretty much near the top of the social scale, having wealth and comfort and means far beyond that of most of our fellow human beings. So what does this mean for us to be humble in our minds, to think of ourselves as being at the bottom? though we are, in fact, all somewhere near the top. I mean, what's the value in this? As I step into my very good car, thinking of myself as though I were poor, thinking of myself as though I were at some low station in life when I'm not. That just seems lame. This isn't what the sentence means. The word humility in verse 12 is defined by the word clothe. And this is a fascinating word in Greek. What it literally means is to tie a knot. And a very specific type of knot at that. The kind of knot that you would secure an apron with. Now, the people who would have used this word every day of their lives in the first century were cleaners, household servants. And every day, they would have turned up to their place of work, they would have gone to their locker, taken out their apron, and as they tied it around their waist, they would have used this very vocabulary. I need to clothe myself with this uniform. As I tie this knot on my uniform, I'm clothing. And I have no doubt whatsoever that as Paul uses this word in this sentence, he's thinking about that earlier episode in Jesus' life where he clothes himself with a towel and proceeds to wash the feet of the disciples. So now that you understand this word clothe, I think you can understand what verse 12, when it uses the word humility, is directing you to in your social interactions with other people. The sentence is saying that you, as a loved Christian, as a person who's valued by God, regardless of what your issues are, you should think of yourself in servile terms. So humility in the New Testament is not to think of yourself or of your abilities in a self-depreciating way. That's just dishonest. If you're awesome, it's okay to say so. If you're brilliant at something, there's no point lying about it. I never do. That's just silly. Humility, rather, is to look at the people in your life, the people you know, the people you don't know, the people at your work, the people in your church, the people in your group of friends, the people in your street, and say to yourself, how can I somehow be of service to those people? Is there anything I can do that can help this person today? Whose feet can I wash? Whose day can I make? Whose life can I improve? What can I do for those whom I see? I may drive a fancy car, I may live in a fancy house and earn a fancy salary, but in my mind, I choose to clothe myself with humility and interpret my role in this world as that of a servant. Then he says, you should clothe yourself with gentleness. Not a very UFC-friendly word, I don't think. The word gentle or meek there is a word that's used in the Bible quite a lot to talk about someone who's poor. So we're not here talking about a person who has, who's sensitive and who cries when he or she watches a chick flick or anything like that. We're talking about a person who is on the bones of his backside and at his wit's end because of life's circumstances. And in the Bible, those people are said to be particularly close to God's mind. And so, over time in the Bible, the word gentleness or meekness came to be used of those who were in deep need, and who out of that need found themselves asking God for help quite a lot. So when the Bible says, be gentle, what it means is, don't be too aware of your own rights. Don't be too aware of your own importance. But instead be aware of how messed up you are and how much you need God's help all the time. Then he says, I think I've had enough of this list already, by the way. Anyway. Then he says you should clothe yourself with patience. Who in the Bible is spoken of as being patient? Who in the Bible really wants people to change, but but waits for them to change? Who in the Bible gets disappointed when people make mistakes, but just gives them a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance? God. This sentence, when it calls for us to be like that, I think is saying, firstly, don't wait for those around you to change and start living differently. You change and live differently. Don't wait for your circumstances to be better before you start living better. Because God is patient with the lack of progress in your life, you should be patient too with the lack of progress in other people's lives. That's a desperately tough thing to hear, I suppose, isn't it? I mean, I've asked for a show. I won't ask for a show of hands because it'll cause difficulties with you and the person you're sitting next to. But if I were to ask you whether or not you sometimes feel frustrated that this other person doesn't change and this other person doesn't improve, and you get disappointed at the lack of progress this person seems to make. That's a frustration we often feel. The Bible says we're not to be like this. We're to wait. Now I would suggest to you, obviously, that these virtues in this particular combination that he lists them here are not for sissies. They're not for those who sign up for a lifetime of getting taken advantage of. We live in a world, I think, where we have to be strong and tough and firm-minded. And for me, the strongest people I know are the people who don't feel that they have to be like the snake pit in which they operate. They don't try to be like the sharks with whom they're forced to swim. They live by their values. And their values are stuck to, regardless of how different they are from the values with which they are surrounded. Then he says, bear with each other. In other words, right, I get it. I know there's people in your life, in your social circle, and the best you can do is just put up with it. That's as good as it's ever going to get with them. And that doesn't sound virtuous, does it? It just sounds exasperated and tired. But sometimes that's the way it is. You just have to accept that there's some people who are never going to be your friends. They're never going to be a person with whom you're going to see eye to eye, and they're just never going to get better from your perspective the way you want them to, and you're never going to click. And it takes every ounce of your virtue just to put up with them. And you'll notice, interestingly, that this business of putting up with people is a conversation that he has in church. He says, hey church, it's not perfect. Sometimes you just have to bear with each other. And I like that because it honestly acknowledges that church, like anywhere else, is made up of all kinds of people. And that being the case, sometimes in church we find ourselves being in close proximity with people whom we find annoying. That's just life. And getting along in life 101 means putting up with the annoyances and the stupidities of other people. Ultimately, of course, more is called for. And so he says, by this point I wish he'd shut up. I'm finding him annoying. I'm bearing with him to this point. But he's not done. He says not only do you have to bear with other people, you have to forgive other people. He says, if any of you has a grievance against someone, poke them in the eye. Surely that's what it's meant to say. Forgive, he says, as the Lord forgave you. So now we're graduating, aren't we, from being annoyed by someone to being hurt by someone, to being wronged by someone. When this sentence uses the word grievance, it refers to the very real and very felt hurts that are brought into your life by the very wrong actions of others. And getting along in church and in life, according to him, means being willing to forgive the people who've wronged you. You know, the New Testament's not, it's only about an inch thick. Right? It's a quarter the size of one Harry Potter novel. You can read it in an afternoon. There's not that much in it. It ain't Shakespeare. No offense. And that being the case, knowing the New Testament is never the issue. Doing it's the issue. We like to think knowing it's the issue because we like to think that we need to learn more stuff. And we talk that way because it's a convenient distraction. I need to know more. I need to learn more. I need to know more. So much I don't know. So much I don't understand. I need to learn more. I need to learn more. That's a smokescreen. We all know all we need to know. Don't know everything, but we know enough. Doing it, applying it, that's our real issue. That's what we are distracted from. And this is a classic example. So you've been hurt by other people. And the simple to understand teaching of the New Testament is that you are to forgive them, not in order that Jesus might forgive you, but because Jesus forgave you. We all know, I think, that damage is baggage. And we are the ones who carry the baggage. And the lunacy of carrying the baggage is we think it somehow punishes the one who caused the damage. Don't we? We carry around all this hurt and all this bitterness and all this unhappiness, and we're kind of saying, I'm going to be miserable, I'll show them. My misery will teach them a lesson. See how unhappy you've made me. See how you've spoiled me. There, happy now. It's just stupid. Hence the New Testament says just drop it. Let it go. Easy to say, hard to do. I know. Next sentence. And over all these virtues put on love. Put it on. Kind of sounds like fake it till you make it. Fair enough. Which binds them all together in perfect unity. So this is fairly elementary stuff. Being a Christian, in a sentence, is about loving God and loving other people. And I like that in this sentence he talks about putting it on. Because let's face it, loving neither God nor people comes naturally. It just doesn't. Sometimes God's hard to like. And most of the time other people are hard to like. Hence it uses the language of discipline. Do it. Just practice it. Then, still speaking about relationships. Still speaking about relationships, he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. Now, the word peace for me is one of the most beautiful words in the New Testament. Paul, of course, was a Jew, and when Jews used the word peace, they weren't just referring to an absence of conflict, but more importantly to the presence of well-being and prosperity. So to say shalom to a first century Jew was to say, I want your life today to be a happy life. I want you to have all that you need for the living of a good life. I want you to have an abundance of happiness, an abundance of material possessions, an abundance of all you need to have a smile on your face today. That's my wish for you. And that's what the word peace means. And from the perspective of the Bible writers, God moved heaven and earth to take Jesus to the cross so that you can have peace with the God who is your judge. From the perspective of the Bible writers, you can lay your head onto your pillow at night and know that whatever else is going on, things are okay between you and God. And that okayness, Paul says, is to rule your heart. The word rule that he uses here is a word that would have been used in the ancient world to describe the thing an umpire did at sporting events. So it's pretty straightforward imagery, really. It's very tall from here. So during a hockey game, this guy skates around, I suppose, and makes decisions, and in contested situations, he controls the game. So in using this word, umpire, referee, rule, to modify the word peace in this sentence, Paul is saying that the peace you have with God and your wish for a good, happy, prosperous life full of well-being is to control the way you play the game every day, especially as you bump along with others during that game. Peace is to be given preference over all other competing desires and wishes. And you are to behave yourself, the sentence would say, in such a way that facilitates peace both for yourself and for others. Like seriously, sometimes you just don't need the hassle, do you? Sometimes what you need to do most of all is just let it go and chill out. There's always going to be silly people who say silly things and who do silly things. There's always going to be mean people who do mean things. In using the word peace in this way, in this sentence, the Bible is saying just thicken your skin a little and let things go. Especially the little things. And it's probably mainly little things. You probably just get yourself upset more than you need to. You're probably bad for your own health. I'll take a question or two in a minute, but I went, I don't know why, because I'm too young and too healthy and too handsome to have problems, but I was in Foodland a couple of months ago, and I was waiting for something, so I went onto one of those blood pressure things. Did you ever do it? I don't know why, I did. And it was high, it was like high, and I'm like, whoa. And so I was this, and then I went back the next day and it was fine, and the next day it was fine, the next day it was fine. But the girl in the pharmacy got to me and says, dude, what are you doing? I said, I came here the other day and it was high. She says, well, it goes up and down. Yeah, but I forgot I'd had like 3 espressos before I went there. And I was at the gym that morning. So anyway, you just worry about stuff more than you need to, and it doesn't do you any good.
Were you looking for a hamburger?
And most of that's true. Any questions about any of that? Yeah, I suppose it's a controversial thing to say, but the point of view in the Bible is that Israel are the chosen people, and the New Testament then uses that language to talk about the church. Some people would find that offensive, but it's biblically true. But I think people get hung up on the word chosen and always go on all sorts of bunny trails. That's certainly been my experience. I think in using the word chosen, the Bible is trying to give us the warm fuzzies. The Bible's trying to take us back to that time we were spotty-faced teenagers at the school dance, and no one would ask us out, no one would date us, no one would ask us for a dance. And the Bible wants us to see ourselves in that situation as being, having all sorts of issues and being in many ways unattractive from a divine perspective, and yet with real pleasure, God walks across the dance floor and says, sure, there's better looking people here, but I want you. With your issues and your baggage and your weaknesses. I know what you've done, I know where you've been, but I choose you. That's meant to make us feel special and to respond a certain way to the Christian lifestyle, I think. Just because I said earlier that God chooses unattractive people doesn't mean I mean, God has standards, dude. I know, I shouldn't have gotten there, but yeah. Even you're shocked. Okay, so think of the Bible as a story, right? So at the start of the story, you've got this garden and everything's great, fine, happy. And then on page 3 of the story, the gears crunch and everything gets messed up. And then there's just this long middle section full of dysfunction and damage and brokenness and perversity and stuff you can't talk about because there's children in the room. Right? There's just this huge section in the middle, and then at the end, the story ends happily. There's people living in a city, and it's great and it's happy. So, from paradise at the beginning to paradise at the end, there's a progression, and in the progression, God is up to something. He's undoing damage. He's healing brokenness. And the choosing aspect is kind of a part of that. To answer your question specifically, the writers of the New Testament talk about, or the Bible, I should say, talk about us being chosen before we were born. They talk about God deciding to love us while we were at the height of our sin, not waiting till we cleaned up our act, because God might have a long wait till that happened. But at our lowest point, at our darkest day, God kind of chooses to be in there. And that's all about God working out the story from paradise, naked in a garden, dysfunction, to paradise. Still in dysfunction, working towards paradise. I don't think we're born perfect and learn brokenness. I don't know about you, but I don't remember ever being taught to be broken. I just kind of picked it up on my own.
Is that another way of teaching?
And I certainly never taught my own kids. I've never sat my son down and said, today, I think we're born with a tendency to, well, the Bible would say that we're born sinful. And what the Bible means by that is we're born with a tendency to mess things up. And you're absolutely right. That natural tendency we have kind of marries perfectly with our environment. And I think it's a fortunate person indeed who manages to get through life without A, causing damage, and B, taking damage on board. That's just life. And I think part of life is learning how to deal with that damage and how to move through it and be stronger at the end of it. And I think our faith helps. It helps tremendously. I'm getting the nod. Does that mean it's sausage and bouncy castle time? What do we do? Just go and have sausage and bouncy castles? No. Okay, let's go have sausage and bouncy castles. Good. More on this next week. Thank you.